She had always believed in direct action. If someone cheated on your friend, if someone lied through a grin that cost someone else sleep, then you did not stand there and compose an Instagram-ready eye roll. You removed the mask, whether it flattered the face beneath or not. The night had the kind of wind that tasted faintly of the harbor, wet, metallic, and carrying the kind of salt that clung to the back of the throat. Serena York stood under a sodium street lamp, sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the chill, a sports bottle in one hand and a vindictive grin warming her cheeks. Daisy had been right there beside her, muttering small curses and planning things that were excellent trouble. Between them, the parking lot was a constellation of headlights and late commuters. Across the asphalt, a man leaned against a gleaming black car, tall enough to look like he belonged in a different sort of light altogether, magazine portraits maybe, or the kind of corporate video with dramatic piano chords. He was neither. He was just a man with a tastefully expensive coat, a watch that caught every light and multiplied it, and the kind of smile that was practiced to appear as artless as possible. "Tell me that's him," Daisy hissed, elbowing Serena so hard she nearly dropped the bottle. "It's him," Serena said, and the satisfaction was immediate. She thought of late-night messages of, "We need to talk," of the way someone's voice had been soft when it should have been firm, of Daisy delivering every small betrayal like an economy-sized box of glass ornaments. It was petty and righteous all at once, and the bottle in Serena's hand felt like a small ceremonial implement. She hadn't planned to ruin a watch. That detail arrived later, in the slow realization when the metal flashed and darkness threaded through the face like a crack. The plan was simply to splash, to fetch a reaction, to leave a memory and a soggy sleeve. She took 2 steps and tipped the bottle. The water arced, a comet of cold, concentrated salt that landed square on the watch, as if time itself had been surprised into motion. The liquid hit with a sound that was almost polite, and then the watch gave up. The crystal clouded, the metal shrank back into a wrongness Serena felt as a small personal victory. The man's expression changed in a way that made Serena's grin freeze. He blinked. Not indignation as she'd expected, not the careful offense Daisy had predicted. For one terrible, delicious second, he looked like every smug cliché crumpled into confusion. He didn't reach to clean the watch or to fling her into legal peril. Instead, he looked at her, then down at his ruined wrist, then up with an expression that read as something like startled amusement. "You did not?" he said. The voice was low, slightly amused, and there was a thread of something else. Interest. The wrong kind of curiosity. Serena's chest did a small, traitorous flip. She told herself to be offended on Daisy's behalf, to be furious and principled and righteous. Instead, she felt like a kid who had just pulled off a trick and caught the magician peeking under the curtain. Without thinking, she barked a laugh. "He looks better without his watch." The man's smile softened, then retreated. He stepped away, brushed off his coat as if the salt had been an annoyance, and did a thing Serena was unprepared for. He reached into his pocket and dug out a card. She should have snatched it and thrown it on the shattered crystal, or at least pocketed it and left like a queen who had done good work and had no time for aftermath. But his fingers were steady, and the card was thick and embossed. It said, "Henry Quinn, Quinn Holdings," in very clean letters. There was a phone number underneath. "You are going to want to fix that," he said, voice polite in the way of people who are used to being obeyed. "And if you're going to spray strangers in parking lots, perhaps check who they are first. There are cameras." Cameras. Serena's stomach fell in a way that felt like the beginning of a draft, a shortness of breath. She hadn't been thinking about footage. She'd been thinking about the immediate small moral victory. The street lamp hummed above them, revealing for the first time the little black dome high on the facade of the strip mall, the imperceptible lens that had blinked on and captured her grin in 3 frames. Somewhere, some hungry little processor might already be rendering the video into a file, and someone might be watching. "You could have apologized," she said, which was true in tone and not in content. Apologizing felt like giving up a trophy. He shrugged, as if apology would have been excessive. "I suppose you think you did us all a favor." She had not meant to be theatrical, but the night was willing, and she found herself rolling her shoulders, stepping toward him because the story needed that final note. "Do you want me to walk away with your dignity?" she offered. "Or do you want me to make sure the rest of your dignity is properly embarrassed?" His face shifted again, and this time she saw something she had not been expecting. Not anger, but a flicker of, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility that he was as human in his arrogance as she was in her impulsivity. Then his hand came up, and she thought he might call security. "Listen," he said, and the way the street hummed around them quieted. "I understand the impulse, but please, leave the watch." Serena blinked. "What? You want me to take it as a souvenir?" He smiled, small and almost sheepish. "No, just let it be. Cameras and I don't mix well in terms of a good story." There was something funny about that, something that knitted itself into the next heartbeat. Serena considered the card, considered the ruined watch. Considered Daisy's small, vengeful grin and the way she would call later, triumphant, thinking her friend's aggression had landed with an admirable thud. "Fine," she said finally, "but you owe Daisy an apology." He tilted his head like a man who had navigated an unusual storm and found it mildly entertaining. "I'll call. And Ms. York?" She had forgotten he'd heard her name. He had the sort of memory for names that belong to people who deal in public image. "You're right," she said before she could stop herself. "You do owe us." He folded the card and slid it back into his pocket, then walked away, the sort of retreat that felt like a rehearsal for some better played scene. Serena watched him go until his silhouette became an unassuming heap of darkness. She exhaled, and the breath fogged cold in front of her face. In the distance, somebody laughed, the sound triangular and cruel. Daisy whooped, making a small trumpet with her hands. They left the parking lot buoyed by victory, foolish and alive. They walked back to the hotel bar where they'd been supposed to meet Daisy's ex, and Serena felt the glow underneath her ribs, hot, a little dangerous. That glow lasted until the next morning, when the thumbnail on Serena's phone announced itself like an approaching car, an email from HR. She groaned, assuming it was about a deadline or a formatting error. Instead, she opened a short, formal notice referencing an incident connected to company property and requesting that she attend a brief interview with security. Beneath the corporate calm of the note, a single sentence pulsed like a red light. "Attention has been drawn to an online post." Serena clicked the link before she thought to breathe. The video was 12 seconds long. In the first frame, under the orange streetlight, a woman with her hair in a messy bun, Serena, hurled a bottle of something across the parking lot. The bottle arced in slow motion, because the uploader had a flair for the dramatic, and the splash landed with an audible smack on the wrist of the man leaning against a black car. The screen cut to a close-up of the man's watch, the crystal blooming afalt like a star, followed by a freeze frame of Serena laughing. The caption below it read, "When she caught him cheating, or did she? #parking lot justice, #CEO life." Her heart went strange, as if someone had reached into the place just below her ribs and tapped a knuckle against the beat. Comments were already streaming in. Amused sympathy, outraged calls for legal action, congratulations, standard internet entropy. But the top comment, pinned, likely by the post's author, read, "Isn't that Henry Quinn, new CEO at Quinn Holdings?" Someone had circled his face, had edited the screenshot, and had posted a headshot pulled from somewhere polished and official. She did what any person with an instinct for survival does in a culture of cameras. She texted Daisy. Daisy's reply was a single string of emojis, a crying laugh face, a grenade, a crown. Then, OMG, he's Henry Quinn? Stacy lied about everything. Stacy was the woman whom Serena had assumed had been wronged. Now she felt a different kind of panic. Professional panic. Henry Quinn was not just a man with a shiny watch. He was the kind of man whose name flashed across business pages, who could make PR teams tumble. He was not a man you drenched in public and then scrolled away with a satisfied grin. The meeting with security could have been the dramatic moment. The taste of fear turned into a speech about what happens when you throw things at people in parking lots and get caught. Instead, it was polite and surgical. A security officer with kind eyes and nails that made her think of someone who clipped them in a ritualized way sat across from her, the HR manager scrubbing notes on a tablet. They were pleasant, pleased even, to be entirely administrative about the breach. "We've received an inquiry from Mr. Quinn," the HR manager said. "He has asked for a meeting to discuss the incident and the damage to his property." Serena felt lightheaded. Damage? "His watch," the man said, as if they were reciting something from a play. "He values privacy and the integrity of his possessions. As such, he's requested—" The HR manager looked to the security officer who mouthed, "One moment," and the HR manager lowered his voice. "A private resolution. He has suggested an offer." An offer. The word hummed around Serena like an insect. She pictured her mother's eyebrows, the way they had climbed whenever the word debt was mentioned. She remembered late rent, the unpaid student loan letters with names that sounded threatening in their legalese. The offer might be monetary. It might be humiliation. The possibilities reeled. But what she had not expected, even in her wildest, caffeinated fantasies, was the precise content of what followed. "He's proposed a public arrangement," the HR manager said, "a staged engagement. He believes that a convincing performance at a family event will neutralize the narrative, and he would like Miss York to participate. The compensation he's offering would cover the damaged item and facilitate an expedited settlement on the matter." The security officer cleared his throat like a man who disapproved of anything that might deliver comedic possibilities. Serena felt the world tilt. She imagined a slideshow, the black watch, a line of bullet points, a spreadsheet labeled setbacks versus PR benefits. It was absurd. It was humiliating. It was illegal plot adjacent. "Excuse me," she said, because she needed to reach air. Her voice came out neutral. She was turning into a procedural object the way her job often required, finding the weak points and testing them. "What does staged engagement mean?" she asked the HR manager. He folded his hands like a man who had been prepared for that question. Mr. Quinn's team framed it as a mutually beneficial performance. He would like Miss York to portray his fiancée at a private family gathering over the weekend. In exchange, he is willing to compensate for any damage and provide an additional fund to cover what he called a release for the incident. There were terms people used to soften their edges: release, compensation, settlement. They were all words carved to make real things sound tidy. Serena's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She thought of Daisy's glossy, conspiratorial expression, of the bottle in the parking lot that still had a little grit in the lip. She thought of being a junior scriptwriter in a firm that paid in thank yous and offered the occasional hit piece to pay the rent. She thought of her mother's voice 3 months ago when the electricity had flickered and they had eaten soup that tasted like stale bread. "You're a good girl. Keep doing good things and the world will notice." The world had noticed. It had also posted a 12-second clip. "How much?" she asked. The HR manager hesitated as if money itself might be a dangerous figure. "Mr. Quinn has mentioned figures ranging. He's asked for discretion. He has also, here's the important part, outlined a formal document to protect both parties." "A document?" Serena echoed. "Like a contract?" "Like a contract," he said, "which, to be clear, is a performance contract.
Mr. Quinn's counsel insists the arrangement is not a marriage or legal union, but rather a public persona agreement to be enacted for the weekend. The phrase public persona agreement made Serena laugh, a short sound that annoyed both HR and security. The laughter surprised her, mostly because it felt like a reflexive protection. The idea of pretending was less terrifying than the idea of her face existing on thousands of phones with a headline about parking lot assault. Pretend being a fiancé was, in a safety calculus, less damaging than pretend being a criminal. "And the watch?" she asked. The security officer pushed a file across the table. Inside, a glossy photograph of the ruined timepiece lay like a crime scene image. A note had been typed and attached. Quinn Holdings has assessed the damage at an estimated value between $1,000 and $5 million. This range was followed by legalese that made even Serena's pragmatic jaw clench. Considerations for brand value, historical. She slid the paper back across as if it burned. "Do you want me to pretend to be engaged to someone who's rich enough to own a watch like that?" she asked. It was not a rhetorical question. She wanted to measure incredulity against the distance of escalation. HR's face was the kind of expression people wear when they want to be sympathetic but cannot afford it. "We are not advising that you do anything. We'll connect you with a mediator. Mr. Quinn prefers to resolve this quietly. He has requested that you meet with him to discuss the terms."
Serena left the meeting with a paper in her hand and a head full of algebraic injustice. Her lunch was cold by the time she reached her desk. Her coworkers, who had been primed by the internet's small cruelties, peered at her like one of those animals at the zoo that make you realize how much we like a live spectacle. One of them, Melissa, whose laugh always arrived a beat too late to be convincing, offered a sympathetic pat that felt like an accusation. Word traveled fast in offices, the way it does in the wild: rumor, spice, and the inevitable garnish. By the time the message from the CEO's office arrived, arranged by the company assistant, Serena had rehearsed every possible response in her head. She had imagined an apology and a brief legal representative. She had not imagined Henry Quinn. He was taller up close than in pictures, thinner somehow, as if the posture of power required a kind of exactness that left the bones long. He had a face designed for profile photographs: strong jaw, eyes that read as both warm and speculating, the kind of cheekbones that seemed to set a schedule. He was wearing a neutral suit as if to be taken seriously, and when he smiled, there was a flash of something almost childlike that made the edges of his arrogance soften. "Ms. York," he said. He pronounced her name like someone who appreciated the syllables. She greeted him with a curt nod and a version of professional calm that had kept her through school deadlines and angry producers. Up close, the watch looked worse than the photographs. The crack spread like an ink blot, dark and stupid across all that polish. "It was an accident," she said. There was a technical way to say it, an untruth that might have soothed him. Instead, she went with exactness. "It was deliberate, actually. We thought he was someone else." Henry's mouth twitched. He had that almost agreeing smile again, a man who had grown used to smoothing the edges of displeasure into policy and gala invites. "That was extremely brave of you," he said, and the compliment landed oddly, like a velvet glove on a fist. "You don't have to be sarcastic," she replied, because sarcasm was easier than fear, and she preferred the armor of barbed edges. "You don't get to be smug and quietly threaten me with legalese." He looked momentarily surprised, and then amused. "No threats," he said, "but I do have proposals." He reached into his briefcase and produced a stack of printed pages bound with a clip. The font was meticulous, the header smelled faintly of money. He slid them across as if this was something he did habitually. The top page bore a playful headline, "Public Persona Agreement, Temporary." Beneath it, legal clauses wandered into a sort of absurdity. Mention of shared photo ops, required small talk topics, a schedule of appearance times, and a list of forbidden questions.
Beneath the humor, there were compensatory numbers that felt like humming neon. The figure was generous, the kind that could undo a month of anxiety and settle a few debtors back into the imaginary safety of solvency. Serena leafed through the pages with a detached sort of horror. There were clauses that mentioned material compensation for reputational mitigation and the need for mutual cooperation. There was a line that read like a joke someone had mistaken for legalese. No romantic obligations shall attach to the parties beyond the staged engagement except by mutual written agreement. There was a laundry list of ridiculous scenario-based penalties, the sort that belonged in an over-caffeinated soap opera writer's draft. Yet, beneath the joke, the numbers were not a joke. They could cover late bills, the cost of her mother's car repairs, a winter's worth of groceries that did not include discount canola oil. "I'm not trying to bribe you," Henry said, as if that word needed to be disowned. "I'm offering to fix what was damaged and to alleviate any potential professional consequences. My grandmother is visiting family this weekend, and—" He hesitated as if weighing the privacy of his grandmother's preferences against his own. "She is old-fashioned. A scandal in the family would be problematic. A convincing public narrative will smooth things." Serena looked at him, then at the contract, then back at him, and for the first time she understood the precise shape of the machine she was in. A family, a company, and a man whose image might cost her everything if she chose the wrong resistance. The world arranged itself into a question with only a few answers. She could refuse and watch the internet do its thing. She could accept and pretend for a weekend, pocket some money, and be done. Or she could choose some middle way, which often, in her experience, involved a lot of paperwork. "It sounds theatrical," she said, "and humiliating." "I'm aware." He leaned forward, elbows on the table as if rehearsing sincerity. "I can also arrange for confidentiality and a firm limit. No future obligations, no job implications. You would be free to decline anything outside of the agreement. I want your consent." Something in the way he said consent, clear, repeated, not a mere formality, kept her rooted. It was the only thing that eased a small alchemy inside her. He could have written a sentence that would have made this feel like debt. He hadn't. He had named choice. "You'll cover the actual cost of the watch," she said, lips thinning, "and my potential damages. And I want a clause that says I'm not to be subject to any internal disciplinary procedures because of this incident." He nodded, quick and sure. "Agreed. And I would like something else. He faltered, searching for phrasing that did not sound like surrender and did not sound like a demand. "I would like you to be truthful in how you portray things. If you decide to do this, I don't want deceit." She almost laughed. Of course he wanted truth. Of course he wanted to control the narrative. "I'm not a liar," she said. "I'm also not a fake fiancé." "You don't have to be," he said. "You just have to be willing to play the part." Serena thought of literally playing a part. She had built plots for a living, constructed betrayals and redemptions out of dialogue and stage directions. She had always been careful of the ethics in the corners of her scripts, motives that didn't excuse harm, choices that did not cheapen agency. She had never written herself into a contract like this. The idea of signing paper with a name that was not hers felt like theater that bled into life. "Can I have time to think?" she asked, because the polite thing was to request hours and to process it like a minor inconvenience. He reached over and left a card on top of the pages. Different from the thick one from the parking lot, this one bore his name and the company crest in neat silver foil. "You must," he said, "but not long. We'll need to coordinate with my grandmother, and there are guests to consider." She left his office feeling like an actor after reading a role that asked too much tenderness and too much humiliation at once. Outside, the quartered afternoon sunlight made the glass facade of Quinn Holdings shimmer as if it were gilded.
People moved through the lobby like extras between takes, earbuds in, shoulders hunched. The world of the building carried a certain kind of confidence that rubbed provocatively against the smallness she sometimes felt in the bones. When she told Daisy, Daisy laughed in the way a person laughs when air is unbearable and the lungs want to break into applause. "Are you kidding? This is brilliant! You will be the best fake fiancé ever!" She clapped like a crowd at the start of a good joke. Also, is it just me, or was he kind of fascinated? Serena pictured Henry in his office, the watch ticking like a flaw, and she felt, irrationally, protective. "He's a CEO," she said, "and if I do this, it's on my terms." Daisy waved a hand. "Of course. Demand double. Demand a tour of the penthouse. Demand a pony. Demand he never calls you by your worst nickname." Later that afternoon, in the cramped comfort of Mason's desk, the office's informal crisis manager and general fixer, Serena tried to parse what felt like an ethics exam into a checklist. Mason, who had once helped her find a missing cat and once helped her hide a wardrobe malfunction during the company holiday party, had a face built for calm. He listened as she explained the clauses she wanted, the limits she would set, and the way she intended to be careful not to be exploited. "You've got to be a lawyer," he said at the end, cheerily, "or at least a clown who knows contract law." "You're not helping," she muttered. "Okay," he said, "but seriously, if you do this, and I can see why you might, the keys are consent repeatedly, clarity, and an exit plan." He tapped the corner of the contract. "No binding marriage, no promotion strings, and write a clause that allows you to walk away if anything becomes more than a weekend." She nodded because he was right. The thing the internet loved most was a woman who took a humiliating bargain and then wrote her way out of it with dignity. The world also loved a woman who tamed its monsters with a smile, then filed the receipts. That night, in a small diner that made its fries overeager and the coffee inexact, Serena sat with the contract printed out and her pen hovering. Daisy had gone home to rehearse her triumphant call to Stacy. Mason had gone back to his spreadsheets. Serena's mother had called earlier to ask about her day. Serena had told a story that omitted large sections of legal peril. Alone, she let herself imagine the weekend. She pictured Henry's grandmother, a small woman with eyes like a hawk who had a reputation for arranging the fates of grown men with a single look. She imagined the set pieces, an awkward family dinner, compliments offered like small bows, posed photographs that could be cropped and curated. She imagined herself as a character in one of her own scripts, dutiful, brave, funny, and ultimately upright. She imagined being paid enough to fix a month's worth of bills and the moral cost of wearing a lie for 72 hours. The pen hovered. Her hand shook a little, not from fear, though there was fear, but from the knowledge that if she signed, the shape of the next few months would change. She flipped to the back page where a line waited for her signature and wrote, in a different voice, the alias that had been a joke earlier that day. Her handwriting always sloped to one side. Tonight, it leaned steady. She printed the name Jennifer Law and watched the ink dry like a promise that might be revoked. She did not feel triumphant when she slipped the papers into the envelope and texted Mason the scan. She felt like someone who had made a bargain in a fairy tale, a step toward warmth and, perhaps, a cost she didn't yet understand. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number as she waited for the elevator. A single photograph of the parking lot, the shot from the night before. Overlaid on it, in block letters, was the caption, "She splashed salt water on the CEO, thinking he was a jerk." The message's subject line was the title she would later see on the web, like a carcass flung into current. If you love accidental meet-cutes, hit like and stay tuned. She nearly deleted the message for theatrics alone, but the moment had something electric about it. The social feed waited. The world arranged itself into likes and comments that waited to pass judgment.
She had taken a sip of the coffee, and it tasted like an apology. That weekend was looming like a theater curtain. She had made a choice. She had arranged the terms that would keep her job safe, or so she believed.
She had not agreed to anything beyond a public performance. She had demanded, repeatedly, consent and clarity. She had not promised love. Love had a way of arriving uninvited into the cracks where people made bargains and then remembered they were alive. Outside the diner, the city brightened into evening light, and the harbor cast a long silver strip across the skyline. Serena folded the contract into her bag like a talisman. She had no idea, as she walked home beneath the sodium lamps, that the man whose watch she had ruined was watching too, thinking about how a woman had surprised him by refusing to be smaller. She did not know that his grandmother would like the story of a woman who could stand up to chaos. She did not know that on Monday the offices would be humming with speculation, that Mr. Hollis would be sharpening his teeth, that a casual photograph could unspool a career. She did know only that she had a choice that night, and that, for reasons that had less to do with money and more to do with something stubborn inside her, she had made the choice herself. When she arrived home, the city's lights winked at the windows like audience applause. She locked the door behind her and stood for a moment in the little hallway where the shadows pooled like people who had been there longer than she had. The contract lay on the kitchen table under the lamp, the alias written on the page like a seed. She poured herself a glass of water, plain, not salted, and drank, letting the coolness cut through the salt of the evening. Across town, Henry Quinn sat in a study that smelled faintly of cedar. The ruined watch nested in an open jewelry box like a fault line. The crystal had spidered in a way that annoyed the symmetry of his life. He was used to solving problems with people in their place. He was less used to being surprised by a woman who made her own calculations and then did the unexpected thing. He picked up the card he'd given her in the parking lot and turned it over in his hands. There was something that had, in the briefness of their encounters, lodged in him that wasn't business and wasn't boredom. He found himself thinking, improperly and not very well, about how the woman in the video had laughed, and how the laugh did not belong to apology. He thought of her signature, Jennifer Law, and of the way someone could choose a name to act beneath. He thought of the weekend approaching, of the theatrics, and of the possibility, sudden and unwanted, that a performance might not remain just a performance. He would have to tell his grandmother. He would have to make arrangements, and perhaps face the small, persistent voice in his chest that had nothing to do with reputation. He would have to invite a woman he barely know into the sanctum of the family, and do so honestly about what he hopes to gain and what he would afford. Somewhere between the choices and their consequences, both of them moved forward like actors stepping into a rehearsal with only 36 hours of line learning. The city hummed. Social media warmed its engines. A weekend that was supposed to be about smoothing wrinkles was becoming a stage. Serena closed the kitchen light and sat on the floor for a long minute, leaning against the cabinet. The alias burned a little under her fingers like a borrowed warmth. She had done her account of the math, numbers stacked, consent checked, exit clauses in place, and somehow it did not make her feel safer. It made her feel like a woman on the edge of a different life, one arranged with handshakes and paper and the peculiar alchemy of proximity. She did not sleep well. When she finally drifted into a light, postponing dreams as one postpones bills, her phone buzzed at 3 in the morning. She fumbled for it with the sweep of someone used to waking to alarms and telemarketing calls. The notification was a direct message from an account she did not know. It contained one sentence: "He looked surprised when you laughed." Serena stared at the text, the words white on black. She could have ignored it. She could have deleted it and hardened herself against the flood of commentary that would arrive like tidewater. Instead, she typed back, because some part of her still needed to answer the world rather than be answered by it.
"People always look surprised when I laugh," she wrote. "They tend to expect other things." As soon as she hit send, she wondered why she'd opened that door. Maybe because she was tired of being watched and not being allowed to be something more complicated than a viral moment. Maybe because she wanted to remind the night that she existed beyond a single frame. Outside, the city sighed, and the harbor took the light and dissolved it into small, sensible waves. The weekend, quieter in wind and louder in consequence, waited like a raised curtain at the edge of a stage. She had signed the paper. She had written an alias as a joke to steady herself. She had made a bargain and kept her dignity intact on paper. But paper, as she had learned both at work and at home, could be persuasive and brittle all at once. When morning came and the sun cut through the curtains in thin, bright knives, the world had already started to decide what to call her. The title appeared in one headline, then another. She splashed water on the CEO, thinking he was a jerk, and that's how love began, one article teased in bold, as if romance could be netted between an embattled watch and a carefully worded clause. Serena read the line and snorted, an involuntary noise that felt like preemptive protest. Love did not begin with a splash. Love began with choices, and with the slow, tender work of being honest when no one was watching.
She folded her laundry and tried to imagine those slow moments between episodes. The small, unshared cups of coffee at 2 in the morning, the silly, private jokes that keep two people from being merely efficient with each other. She thought of the possibility that Henry might be different inside his perfect face, that perhaps the arrogance she saw was armor rather than truth. She thought of Daisy and of Mason and of her mother and of all the small economies that made life in a city worthwhile. By noon, the PR wings had begun to flap. A staffer called asking an unrelated question and paused when he realized she was aware of the coverage. Mr. Hollis, whose attentions in the office were usually expressed as barbed compliments and the occasional undermining memo, sent a message with the casual cruelty of someone who sees advantage. Curious to see how this will affect project timelines. The phrase implied so many things: a warning, a delight. Serena felt the office shrink around her like a stage set closing in. She had made a deal. She had kept her voice in the negotiation. She had insisted on safeguards. She had, in a way she had not expected to feel, chosen the steps to walk into this improbable weekend. The alias she had written sat in the envelope on the kitchen table like an inked talisman. Beyond the window, the city pulsed, indifferent and eager, and the first seeds of a story had been planted. She did not yet know how deep the roots would grow. She did not yet know that the ripples from a saltwater splash could travel through lives and agendas and the brittle happiness made in the corners of family rooms. She knew only that when the curtain rose, she would be on stage, and that performances, when sincere, sometimes leave the actors changed. The carousel of notifications continued like a tiny rain on a tin roof. Comments, shares, the inevitable memes. Serena locked her phone in the drawer and let it lie quiet. For a moment, she allowed herself simply to be, to sit, to breathe, to make a list of contingencies with the thoroughness of someone who wrote narratives for a living. She wrote down the things she would not do, the lines she refused to cross, the person she needed to be for herself no matter what the cameras decided to render. When she closed the notebook, the pen left a little crescent of ink that looked, absurdly, like a smile. At 3 in the afternoon, her phone vibrated. The message was brief and precise. Henry Quinn. "We should meet in my office at 4, his message read, simple as if arranging coffee. Serena stared at the screen for a long beat, thumb hovering over the reply. 4 o'clock could be a negotiation, or a trap, or a quiet hour where two people who had been reduced to headlines might manage to be civil. She typed, "Okay, you're," and hit send before she could tidy the sentence into politeness. She arrived early, the city sun collapsing across the glass facade like a cinematic filter. The receptionist, whose job seemed to be to look both bored and vigilant,
handed her a small company-issue badge that allowed her to pass beyond the lobby's glass maw and into corridors that smelled faintly of lemon polish and confidence. Her heart was a metronome of small, efficient beats. She felt like someone about to attend a rehearsal for a play whose ending she did not yet know. Henry's assistant, Mason, had warned her, was efficient to the point of being a satirical poem. The assistant who met her at the door was precisely that, efficient, crisp, and businesslike, with a manner that implied a small file cabinet where emotions went to be stamped. He led her to the same office where she'd first signed, where the contract lay folded in a neat envelope on the mahogany table as if nothing between them had shifted. Henry was already there, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that wasn't quite a smile. The ruined watch sat on a white cloth like an accusation and a relic. Today, his suit was the color of midnight air, and there was a softer alignment to his shoulders that suggested he was bracing for a conversation he wanted to make fair. "Ms. Law," he said when she entered, using the alias like a test, "thank you for coming." She closed the office door behind her and felt the click of privacy like glass. "Henry," she said, "we can skip the theatrics." He gave a small laugh, which surprised her with its openness. "I meant it when I said consent was important. I want this to be your choice. If you decide against it, you'll be back to whatever normal you had before a bottle and a weird headline." She sat, an actor settling into a chair whose purpose was to hear the truth. The contract lay between them, but for the first time she noticed the extra pages he'd added since the diner. Clauses about confidentiality, of course, but also a clear HR-reviewed addendum that stated the arrangement would be public performance only, that Serena would not face internal disciplinary action, and that Henry's team would cover legal costs should anything in the future require further clarification. There was even, to her mild surprise, a clause that Henry would not be in a position to influence her employment or pay during the next 6 months. "It looks like you had a list of my demands," she said, skimming it, "and managed to make them reasonable." "I thought it fair to make them non-horrific," he said. "Also, my grandmother has a direct line to my counsel. I told them explicitly, no leverage." When she looked at him, expecting some smirk, she found him earnest, stripped of the practiced air that usually flattered his confidence. He nodded. "I don't want to look like a man who buys favor or retribution. I want the family to believe in a narrative that keeps my grandmother calm. I also don't want anyone acting like I coerced you." "You did," she began, then stopped. The grammar of that sentence had teeth. Did, had, might have. She opted for clarity. "You offered an option that felt like pressure in the way it came down a hierarchy, but you've taken steps to change the context." "Exactly." He leaned back, and there was a flicker, a private calculation. "And we'll be transparent about HR oversight. You will have a point of contact. If anything crosses a line, emotional, physical, whatever, you call them. We stop." Serena's fingers found the edge of the contract and smoothed it as if flattening a wrinkle from the air. "I will do it," she said, the words like a project plan unfolding. "On one condition. I get to negotiate the moments that feel like they cross personal boundaries. If a photograph requires kissing or," she gestured vaguely, "any staged intimacy, I reserve the right to say no." He held her gaze without flinching. "Agreed. And I will not," he stopped, searching for words he did not often need. "I will not expect anything from you that I wouldn't expect from a professional actor in similar circumstances. No surprises, no hidden clauses." They signed the addendum. Serena's pen felt ceremonial as it slid across the line that meant she could, if needed, walk away. When they shook hands, it felt like the completion of a negotiation rather than the beginning of something more intimate. That night's arrangement had a scaffolding of safety, and that was what allowed both of them to relax, slightly, into the oddity of the weekend ahead. "Technically," Henry said, with a small smile that leaned into wryness, "you're the best fake fiancé in corporate history." "You're the best CEO who brings dossiers to parking lot incidents," Serena shot back. "That's an award for something." They both laughed, and for a sliver of a second the rest of the office vanished. Just two people who had found, in a world of headlines, a way to be unexpectedly human. Rehearsals took the shape of one small, insistently staged improvisation after another. Henry's grandmother, Madam Quinn, known more often as Grandma in conversation and Little Tyrant in mischievous office whispers, preferred efficiency and liked to see rehearsals as both charm school and diagnostic. She had decided to call Serena on the phone the night before the family gathering, and the call had landed like a small thunderclap. "You must be Miss Law," Madam Quinn began, her voice the crack of a whip softened by fondness. "Henry tells me you're a woman who laughs when she should scold. That is promising." Serena was not prepared for how the tiny woman would reduce her to a subject of affection. There was no bluster in the voice, only a directness that made Serena feel like someone being measured for a costume she would, in the end, be allowed to outgrow. "You will be comfortable with the family," Madam Quinn continued. "No wild tales. Speak plainly. You will not invent romance when we ask for taste. Be honest."
Honesty is... She paused. And in that pause, Serena felt a history of matchmaking that had patched generations together. A currency. We appreciate it. Madam Quinn's approval, delivered from across town and through a small speaker, felt like a blessing that also asked for competence. The family weekend at Quinn's Riverton estate unfolded with the sort of precision that made rehearsed theater look spontaneous. Photographers avoided the lawn like polite zombies until the family assembled. The house smelled like lemon and old wood. The staff moved through corridors with choreographed ease. Serena arrived with Daisy in tow, Daisy having insisted she be included because, if you're going to be a fake fiancé, I need to be a co-conspirator, and found herself ushered into a world where everything was both slightly larger and more fragile than it looked on paper. The evening's events were simple in their architecture: cocktails, a casual dinner, and a garden stroll to mend any wounds. Serena's performance required small things: knowing the name of Henry's cousin, making a joke about a summer house, feigning familiarity with a chestnut anecdote. These were the sorts of minutiae she could wing. She had spent a life fabricating backstories for characters who needed to feel real on camera. Henry remained steady, a practiced host who also seemed oddly present when she needed him to be. He complimented her laugh in moments that felt unrehearsed, and in his presence she discovered that being intentionally comfortable could be a kind of radical truth. In the middle of the dinner, when lantern light made the plum sauce shimmer, and Aunt Viola, an emphatic, patient woman with a million matchmaking opinions, delivered a toast to unexpected connections, Serena caught a look from Henry that made something shift. They walked into the garden afterward, the night wrapped around them like a velvet cloak. "You were good in there," Henry said, under his breath, as if praising her to anyone but her. "You had a practiced face," she replied. "You should sell that to the theater." He made a small noise, half laugh, half protest. "Are you okay with all this?" he asked. It was the simplest question and one of the most dangerous. "I have limits," she said, "and I have an exit plan if things go sideways. I'm okay with my terms." "And I'm going to make sure we stick to them," he promised, with a gravity that wore no costume. The honesty of his tone settled across the space between them like a pledge rather than a plot device. That week, back in the office, their performance leaked at odd hours into something more complicated, a proximity that began to erode the sharpness of their guardedness. They rode elevators together and learned the small patterns of each other's habits. Serena's restless foot tap when she was thinking, Henry's tendency to click the end of a pen when nervous. They shared coffee in the kitchen, where he confessed a childhood memory of hiding in a hedge to avoid an overly enthusiastic aunt. She told him, without pretense, about a college production she'd botched and the way she had learned to turn embarrassment into material. It wasn't romantic at first, it was breathable.
It was two people discovering that the story they'd been handed by the world, CEO and viral woman, didn't map neatly onto the complicated human things they were discovering together. The contract hung between them like a formal stage light, necessary, but not the whole show. Then, in a moment that neither of them planned, it happened. The first kiss. It came after a long day of rehearsals, after a department dinner where they'd had to play lovers at a podium while the cameras took mild interest. They had gone back to the office to sign a few final pages and to take a photograph that would be used in the family album, a staged portrait meant to close any lingering tabloid questions. They stood, for a moment, in the quiet of Henry's office, where the city sprawled like an obscene postcard beyond the glass. Henry handed her a single cup of coffee and reached for the camera with the same casualness he used for board meetings. Serena laughed at a private joke he'd told, a small sound like a popped bubble. He looked at her, and in that look she saw the outline of something not purely theatrical. He stepped closer, as if the proximity had been, up until then, an agreed plot point, but now it was optional, a choice he was making without checking a clause. "Do you want to?" he started, a sentence that trailed toward intimacy. She found she wanted to see if the kiss would feel performative or sincere. She leaned in before she gave the decision sound, and their lips met briefly and curiously, like two actors trying a scene for pageantry and finding themselves surprised by the realism of it. It was not a movie kiss, no fireworks or soundtrack, but it was close enough to startling. They pulled away, both of them laughing at their own shock. "We should probably document this," Serena joked, because humor was the safe place between them. "We should document everything," Henry agreed, and there was an earnestness to his tone that made the humor fragile. He looked at her with a clarity that unsettled and intrigued her. "But only if you want to." She nodded. "For now, the contract says mutual consent. And for now," he said, "we respect that." Their first kiss, brief and nothing more, would become a story, both for themselves and for others, about the difference between staged affection and something that grows at the edges of performance. It was the first real step into a territory that neither had expected to inhabit. The Riverton weekend had been an orchestrated waltz. The second week's social scene threatened a far more chaotic tune.
Serena's college friends had arranged a rooftop bar, the kind of place that specializes in craft cocktails and the nostalgia of shared maladventures. Felix, her college crush, who had once eaten an entire pizza as part of a dare and had called Serena his co-conspirator in art crimes, was there with Lilith, a woman whose laugh could split a room and whose stance suggested she was a seasoned competitor in matters of attention. Felix spotted Serena and walked over with the warmth of someone returning to a favorite chapter. His eyes crinkled when he saw her. The reunion had the kindness of people who remembered a past without wanting to live in it again. "Serena York," he said, using her full name like a handshake. "You've somehow become more interesting since college." She rolled her eyes, pleased and slightly unnerved. Daisy dragged her into the circle. Henry, who had been invited because Madame Quinn liked to keep her public scenes tidy, stayed slightly apart, watching with a curiosity that made Serena feel simultaneously exposed and safe. Felix had drunk enough courage to be sentimental. "I should tell you something," he said, sincerity wobbling in the face of his nerves. He stepped closer, the city lights offering them an intimate stage. "I've always liked you." There it was, an old confession offered new with the weight of present possibility. Serena felt her chest tighten in a familiar way, a tenderness that belonged to a version of herself who had once hoped for this exact moment. She felt the swell of memories, late study sessions, a shared red scarf, the way he had once defended her in a seminar argument. "Felix," she said slowly, wanting to be kind and clear, But before she could answer, Lilith interjected with the sort of easy charm that had the terse efficiency of someone who'd weathered this before. "Oh, how sweet." The phrase was sweet and dismissive at once. She smiled at Felix with the kind of blink-and-you're-approved affection that suggested claim staking.
The situation could have been a simple dramatic beat in a romantic comedy, an old crush, a new complication. But then a phone vibrated in someone's hand and a new element thundered into their orbit, a social media post, freshly minted and vivid. Someone had photographed a private moment, the garden kiss from Riverton, and set it alongside an edited shot of Henry apparently towering over Serena in the office, with a caption that suggested intimidation. The juxtaposition suggested predation rather than partnership. The comments flooded in with the quick cruelty of the internet. Daisy cursed under her breath. "That's not cool," she said, voice flat. "They photoshopped the boardroom one so it looks like he's looming." Serena snatched the phone from a friend's hand and felt the drop in her stomach, the same queasy twist that had accompanied the parking lot video.
This new post tailored a narrative that made Henry the aggressor and her the passive participant, a dangerous remix that might undo everything they'd worked to make clear. Henry, who had been watching the exchange, went pale enough that Serena wondered if a portrait had been painted in less flattering tones. He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled, jaw working. "This is doctored," he said, not as an accusation but as a fact he wanted to rectify. Felix stepped forward, which left Serena with a heart suddenly juggling two possibilities: the old warmth she'd felt for him and the complicating closeness of Henry. Felix's admission now hung in the air like a question mark. She turned to him, to Henry, to the group, and realized how absurdly public their private choices had become. "People will twist anything," Henry said, and his voice, usually a guarded instrument, was a raw thing. "We'll release the full photos. We'll put HR on notice if anything else appears. No one will use a doctored image to install a false narrative." Serena nodded, but the damage of a meme is not always numerical. It is cultural, the way a frame can shape perception. The post made their lives a contested space. It removed nuance and replaced it with outrage and selling headlines. It wasn't long before the post metastasized into something bigger. Mr. Hollis smelled an opportunity and moved with the predator's patience of a political operative. He forwarded the image to senior staff with a note that read, "We need to address leadership optics." He hinted at the specter of litigation and reputational harm, his words precise as scalpel cuts. The rumor mill churned, HR schedules multiplied. The narrative became a machine that mashed complexity into digestible outrage. Serena felt the old pinch of visibility, the way being known sometimes felt like being marked. She found herself wanting to retreat into anonymity, to curl up in the quiet corners of a writing room and let the world forget her. Instead, she relied on the one tool she knew how to wield: words. She drafted a statement and, with Henry's permission, read it into the phone for a small video. No polished graphics, no PR gloss, just her voice and a clear set of facts. She said they had consented to a temporary public performance, that the agreement was reviewed by HR, that no coercion had taken place. She acknowledged the power imbalance and emphasized that transparency and HR oversight existed precisely to prevent coercion. The video was not a PR machine's glossy production. It was a woman speaking plainly into a camera, the kind of honesty that disarmed people more effectively than spin. The video circulated, and for a few hours, the conversation began to pivot from viral accusation back to context. The worst of the edits were exposed, metadata revealed manipulations, and a few brave small accounts did the digging that reassured the public that the photos had been altered. Still, the echo of the accusation did not disappear. It left a residue in the office. Whispers crept back into meetings. Mr. Hollis's notes now read like quiet barbs. Serena felt the tension like a small animal pressed against her ribs. She also felt, strangely, a swell of solidarity. People came forward, employees who'd seen Henry behave with decency in lesser observed moments. Madam Quinn called a family friend in a way that made certain staffers sit up straighter.
Daisy bombarded comment threads with reasons to consider the evidence. Mason quietly spiked a rumor about Hollis's propensity to judge while ignoring his own record. The skirmish lines made the eventual public showdown inevitable. The company had scheduled a town hall meeting, an attempt at corporate therapy, where HR stood like a referee and the board sat like jury. It was here, under a fluorescence and projector glare, that the story would either curdle into a cautionary tale or be reassembled into something human. On the day of the town hall, the auditorium smelled like coffee and conscientiousness. Employees packed the chairs with the polite interest of people who wanted truth but feared spectacle. Henry arrived with a serenity that betrayed how much was at stake. The future of a brand, the shape of relationships inside an office, and the personal reputations of everyone involved. Mr. Hollis sat at the front with the implacable smile of someone who believed in his argument's inevitability. Cameras were present. The meeting had a live stream for transparency. HR introduced the panel and read the summary of the incident into the microphone with the dryness of legal briefing. Then they turned the floor over to Serena. She had rehearsed this, lines polished, arguments mapped, but rehearsed speeches have a way of feeling hollow if they do not begin in the heart. When she stepped to the microphone, the floor seemed to inhale. She saw faces in the auditorium, colleagues who'd shared coffee, the receptionist who smiled her smallest smile, Mason near the back with a thumb up that steadied her, and Henry whose eyes met hers across the stage. She began with a small, irreverent joke, an anchor that made people listen, and then sailed into the simple facts. She explained consent as a series of actions they had negotiated. She spoke about agency, about how being paid for a weekend to portray a role is not the same as being coerced into love. She acknowledged the power dynamics plainly, refusing to minimize them. She held them, HR, Henry, the company, her colleagues, accountable and human. "We live in a culture that loves a story that is neat," she said, "but our lives are not always neat. I made a choice. I negotiated for my safety. I asked for a plan to leave if anything became more than a weekend. And I am not ashamed of choosing my safety and my dignity." Her voice, which had been a husk of earlier nervousness, found steadiness as she spoke the truth.
She told a story about the parking lot, about a woman who was angry and precise, and who, in the act of public shaming, had also been exposed to the merciless glare of public judgment. She told the truth about the edited image. She told it in detail, names, dates, HR steps, and the room listened. When she finished, there was a pause, like the held breath before applause. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then a ripple of support built. Not a tidal wave, but a steady swell of people appreciating clarity and courage. Henry stood and walked to the stage, and in the moment, the room held together like a tent. "I need to be clear," he said, facing everyone. "We designed a temporary plan to handle a private incident with a public edge. It was my idea to protect my family's reputation. I never intended to pressure Ms. York. The agreement was explicit about her autonomy. I asked HR to oversee it. If anyone here felt otherwise, I want to know so we can correct it. If this incident has revealed anything about our company culture that needs changing, I accept that responsibility. Mr. Hollis's interest should have been to protect the company, not to leverage this for personal advantage." The last line landed like a line drawn in the sand. Mr. Hollis, who had been confident, found himself the center of a new scrutiny. His smile thinned. Then Madam Quinn, who had been watching in the front row with appropriate skepticism, rose. Her voice was small but fierce. "My grandson has many errors, but this one is about a watch and a very loud bottle," she said, her bluntness cutting through corporate jargon. "If you ask me, Ms. York did not deserve to be dragged through the mud. We will not fight this by mud. We will fight this with facts. Also, Henry, as your grandmother, I will remind you to buy better watches." Laughter punctured the tension, and the auditorium eased. In the weeks that followed, the company issued clarifications. HR had reviewed the agreement, transparency protocols were improved, and Mr. Hollis, whose opportunism had been exposed in a flurry of emails where he'd suggested punitive measures and possible scapegoats, found his influence diminished. He was reassigned to a division where his appetite for internal politicking did less harm. The corporate machine, when confronted with the right kind of honest attention, had a way of correcting itself, albeit clumsily. More importantly for Serena, the scandal's sting dulled. The doctored images were labeled as manipulated in public notices. The narrative shifted from viral accusation to a more complex story about privacy, image, and consent. People disagreed, of course they did, but the trend favored nuance over outrage. Through all of it, Henry and Serena's relationship shifted from performance to something quietly genuine. They practiced kindness in small ways. He would bring extra coffee when hers was cold. She would leave post-it notes with jokes on his desk. They began to share more of themselves, the small failures and the deeper embarrassments that bind people together without spectacle. Their kisses became less like rehearsed cues and more like punctuation marks in a developing sentence. The real turning point came not in a staged moment nor a headline, but in a small room at the hospital where Madam Quinn had a routine procedure and the family gathered, nervy and tender. Serena sat at the foot of the bed while Henry stood near the window, his hand resting against the glass. His grandmother smiled at her with a look that felt like an absolution and a benediction. "You have been steady," she said, eyes crinkling. "You did not perform falsehood, you performed kindness." Madam Quinn's approval landed differently now. It was not merely relief at a scandal's containment, but an acknowledgement that something real had occurred. She reached out and squeezed Serena's hand, the kind of gesture that transmutes public theater into private acceptance. You could measure the shift in how people referred to them. Where once the headlines called her the viral woman and him the CEO, now colleagues used their first names with less curiosity and more normalcy. The contract remained an artifact of the past, legally closed, but the emotional work of trust was ongoing. Henry had insisted they disclose their arrangement to HR and then take further steps to neutralize the power differential. He agreed to an internal recusal from any personnel decisions that might affect Serena, and he accepted that any advancement in their relationship would be navigated publicly and transparently. "And if one day we choose to be more than this," he said, quietly, after the hospital visit, "I will step out of the chain of command. I will make whatever changes are necessary to ensure there is no question of power imbalance." Serena appreciated the clarity in his vow. It was a promise not of fairy tale rescue, but of structural adjustments, pragmatic, grown-up, and respectful of the harm his position could inflict unintentionally. It was a promise that recognized agency as a thing to be preserved, not rearranged. The last conflict came from the strangest of sources, Felix. He had retreated for a while, embarrassed by the social media maelstrom and his own ill-timed confession. Then, at a quiet coffee shop, he approached Serena with a softness that was not performative. "I was selfish," he said. "I remembered college like a highlight reel and forgot there were people in the present who needed me to be kinder. I'm sorry." Serena listened. Felix's apology was sincere, and she accepted it with the grace she would have wanted from a version of herself in his place. Their conversation was tidy. No vow of rekindled romance, just two people making peace with the fact that lives change and the past is not always a map for the future. Lilith, unsurprisingly, handled the unraveling with the precision of someone who protected what she chose. She and Felix parted amicably. The drama compacted into an interesting anecdote for their friends. The city moved on. Then, in a moment that felt entirely ordinary and yet perfectly fitting, Henry asked Serena, in private, to have dinner. Not staged, not photographed, not rehearsed. He reserved a small table at a modest restaurant they'd talked about months ago but never visited, somewhere that made honest food and didn't care about presentation. They ordered a bottle of wine, nothing ostentatious, and talked about the mundane future, what kind of plants they liked, whether they wanted dogs, the absurdity of gossip columns. "You said once that love doesn't begin with a splash," Henry said, stirring his water like someone mapping out bravery. "No," Serena replied, "love begins with choices." He smiled, a real one this time, and reached across the table to take her hand. The gesture was simple and profound because it was a choice, voluntary and offered without the legal scaffolding that had once protected them. "Then choose me," he said, earnest, "not because of any contract or headline, but because I make you laugh, and because I want to be the person who does the hard things with you. I'll step out of roles that risk that fairness. I won't hide, and I'll be honest about my faults." Serena looked at him with a vulnerability that surprised her. To accept such an offer required a leap of faith. She thought about the parking lot, the bottle, the ruined watch, the contract, the hospital room, the town hall, and the long and sometimes tender process of reassembling trust. She thought of the weeks of rehearsals that had proven to be less about falsehood and more about discovery. "I choose you," she said, slowly, "because choices deserved time. But on terms we write together." He laughed, the kind of laugh that was relief and delight sewn into one sound. "I'd like that." They built their terms not on a piece of signed paper, but on promises that had real teeth. Transparency, HR oversight, and mutual agreement to step back whenever the power dynamic made itself obvious. Henry announced to the board, voluntarily, that he would recuse himself from decisions relating to Serena, and he set a precedent by inviting HR to remain a visible arbiter of their interactions for a period. It was a public gesture that dissolved a private power imbalance into an accountable plan. The company valued stability. Mr. Hollis's influence waned. His reassignment carried a kind of quiet defeat that made the rest of the executives reassess their appetite for silent ambition. The scandal that had once threatened to bend their narrative into a cautionary tale became instead a case study in corrective transparency. Mistakes were made, some people acted poorly, but structures could be improved when the people in power chose to change them. The final public scene had the bittersweet charm of a rom-com wrap. A press conference where Henry and Serena stood together, not to perform a marriage, but to announce a foundation partnership, a charity initiative aimed at media literacy and protecting people from image manipulation. It was not a dramatic bowing out, it was a pivot. They spoke together, Serena with frankness, Henry with accountability, and the press, who loved the theatrical arc, obliged with mild curiosity and sincere interest. The cameras lingered longer on the initiative than on their personal lives, which felt, to both of them, like a healthy victory. Then, months later, in a small, sunlit clearing outside Madame Quinn's favorite tea room, Henry knelt on one knee. No television cameras, no PR teams, just birds and the soft rustle of a city that had learned to be less loud about personal affairs. "Serena York," he said, and his words were measured. "I want to choose you every day. I want to be steady in ways that matter. Will you marry me? Not as a solution, not as a narrative, purely as a choice." Serena felt the world hush. Everyone in the small circle, Daisy with her triumphant grin, Mason with suspiciously watery eyes, Madame Quinn with a satisfied smirk, held their breath. She remembered the bottle in the parking lot, the contract on her kitchen table, the moments of vulnerability and negotiation. She remembered how she'd insisted on agency and how he had met her insistence with structural respect. "Yes," she said, because she had thought long and hard about the terms and because his actions had matched his words. The kiss that followed was gentle and real, an exclamation point to years of messy human work. Madame Quinn clapped with the theatricality of someone who had placed a bet and won. "About time," she said, and it was the highest compliment she could imagine.
They married later with a small ceremony. Friends and family, no splash photography, just honest vows and a reception where daisy chains and fairy lights made the night feel like a private world. Henry read a page from a book Serena loved. Serena confessed a secret line of dialogue she'd once written that made Henry laugh until he cried. They celebrated not as a publicity stunt, but as two people who had navigated public messes and private fears to land somewhere steady. In the epilogue, an unpretentious week of married life, Serena cooked a too-salty soup, while Henry attempted to fold a fitted sheet and failed spectacularly. They argued gently about where to hang a painting and compromised on an arrangement that pleased neither but made both laugh. Madam Quinn visited with fresh lemon cookies and a new watch on her wrist. "For Henry," she said, and Serena looked at the family, at the life, and felt a kind of quiet victory that had nothing to do with money or headlines.
On a small balcony above the city, with the harbor sighing in the distance like an old friend, they sat together, shoulders touching, watching light turn to evening. "You splashed salt water on me, thinking I was a jerk," Henry said, smiling into the mundane. "And you were a jerk," Serena replied, because honesty remained the spine of their story. "But then we became less of jerks," he said, and his voice held a warmth that made her heart fold into itself. They sat in companionable silence, the kind that only comes after a lot of talking and a lot of listening. In the distance, a school of tourists argued about maps, a couple argued about the menu of a nearby cafe. The city lived on, indifferent and necessary. Serena thought of the absurdity of a headline that had promised love at the end of a viral clip. She had wanted, once, to be the woman in the frame who confronted wrongdoing. She had not expected that her life would twist into a romantic storybook, and she had never wanted to be rescued. Instead, she had found someone who respected her boundaries, who corrected for his privilege, and who chose justice as much as affection. She raised her glass. He raised his. "To choices," she said. "To choices," Henry echoed. And they drank, in the way people drink when the world has finally agreed, if only for a moment, to be kind. If you enjoyed this rom-com roller coaster, subscribe and watch the next story.